Chapter 34, Sunday, November 17th through Sunday, November 24th, 1776. We have now got near 5,000 prisoners in New York, and many of them are such ragamuffins as you never saw it in your life. Letter of a British officer published in the London Packet newspaper. I had no time to ponder Curzon's fate. Madam commanded that a supper be thrown to celebrate the capture of Fort Washington, complete with turtle soup. The house fair exploded with dust and activity. The junior officers cleared out their cots, clothing, and maps from the second-floor drawing room so we could scrub and polish it from ceiling to floor. The kitchen hearth was crowded with irons heating to press the tablecloths and serviettes. Madam hired the cook from the city tavern to prepare the meal. Folks said he had a way with turtles. She then chose the prettiest of the soldier wives to wait at the tables. The ugly ones and Sarah with her big belly were to stay in the kitchen to assist the cook and wash up. My job was to ferry the food up the stairs and the dirty cookery down. The food began arriving long before sunup, packed into crates and hauled by sleepy-eyed boys. 3 turtles, each the size of a footstool, came in a wooden pen. The sound of their flippers scratching made Sarah yelp in fright. 2 of the turtles kept their heads tight against their shells. The third stretched out his neck and watched the commotion with wet, solemn eyes. While we scurried to finish the house and the cook butchered the turtles and plucked the pheasants, the hairdresser arrived to tend to Madam. We spent hours applying pomatum wax, patting and the length of brick-colored hair to fashion a high roll on Madam's head. The hair swept off her brow and soared into the air like a wave curling before a ship's prow. I thought the wave might crumble on Madam, did not ask my opinion. She wanted a pot of hot chocolate made with 2 handfuls of sugar, which was a shocking amount. Sarah and the cook were exchanging heated words in the kitchen. Empty turtle shells stood drying in the corner, and the cook's assistant stirred the thick soup bubbling over the fire. I grabbed the chocolate pot and left, not wanting to see what became of the poor creatures' heads. As I served the hot chocolate and tidied the chamber, Madam rubbed her face with Venetian bloom water beauty wash, said to remove wrinkles. After that came a layer of Molyneux's Italian paste, to make her skin white as bleached linen. It made her resemble a corpse. And then the final triumph. She used a tiny brush to paint a thin line of glue above each eye. Madam opened an envelope and shook out 2 gray stripes of mouse fur, each cut into an arch. Leaning toward the mirror, she glued the mouse fur onto her eyebrows, making them bushy and as thick as fashion required. In truth, she looked like a woman with 2 lumps of mouse fur stuck on her face. A delicate bell sounded overhead, Lady Seymour summoning help. The guests will be arriving soon, Madam said, admiring her reflection. Aunt Seymour wishes to be seated in advance of them. You may assist her. After I helped the lady limp from her chamber to her place near the head of the long table, I placed a foot warmer filled with hot coals under her chair and spread a woolen blanket on her lap. She thanked me kindly and looked about. When I was young, we dined thus every night, she said with a sigh. I could scarce credit it. The table was covered by the finest linen tablecloth I'd ever seen. Each place had china plates, crystal glasses, and ivory-handled knives and forks. Candles were positioned every 3 heads. Salt cellars, each with a tiny spoon, and pepper mills were set in easy arm's reach of each place. Smaller tables and sideboards were positioned at the edges of the room to hold trays and dishes. One table was covered with wine bottles. Candlelight reflected back again in the polished mirrors that hung from the walls. I caught a glimpse in the hearth mirror of a girl with a mark on her cheek that trumpeted her shame. I quickly turned my eyes away. There was a heavy knock on the front door. It begins, Lady Seymour said. Go below, child. I set the tray loaded with the turtle soup bowls on the table by the door. 3 more trays needed to be brought up the stairs, but I allowed myself a quick peek at the company before I fetched them. The table was crowded with officers wearing splendid uniforms and perfectly powdered wigs, along with several of Master Lockton's business companions. Lockton wore a cardinal red satin waistcoat, black satin coat and breeches, and shoes with silver buckles. The new clothes could not hide the fact that the master was grinding himself down with work. Long hours serving the British commandant had melted off the fat from his second and third chins and created heavy black circles under his eyes. But his bags of gold grew fatter, and that was what he cared for the most. Madam reigned over her end of the table with the occasional flutter of her fan and wave of her hair above her brow, threatening to crash at any moment. Lady Seymour, the only other woman present, looked like an elegant spider wrapped in her black lace shawl. Her eyes were lively in the candlelight, and her cheeks had color in them for the first time in weeks. The officer next to her was the size and shape of Edward, the shaggy bull who lived down the road from us in Rhode Island. The man did not have a ring in his nose, but he laughed with an impatient snorting sound. I hurried up and down the stairs with the remaining trays of soup, then the roasted tongue and mushrooms. The servant girl cut the meat on Lady Seymour's plate before setting it down so that the weakness of her arm would not hinder her. The young soldier who was appointed wine steward danced around the backs of the guests, keeping their glasses full. The conversation flowed as fast as the wine, the taking of Fort Washington, news from London, plans for a fox hunt. At this last, an officer joked that the next fox would be a tall sort from Virginia, by the name of George Washington. That caused hearty laughter all around and glasses raised. A servant girl hissed at me to go back to the kitchen. When I entered the room half an hour later, my arm shook under the weight of the tray. The cook had prepared enough to feed a battalion: pheasant stuffed with figs, stewed oysters, potted larks, greens cooked with bacon, pickled watermelon rind, and buttered parsnip. The pheasant smelled good. I had hopes that some might find its way into the scraps bucket. By the time I lugged in the dessert tray, rice pudding, lemon biscuits, 2 creamed pear tarts, and an iced cake, the fire was blazing and the room was much warmer. Lockton had freed the top buttons of his waistcoat, and 2 of the officers had loosened their lace neckcloths. The heat had softened the glue of Madame's left mousy eyebrow, and it had begun to free itself from her face. She did not notice this. The serving girls and wine steward watched the progress of the eyebrow and fought to keep smiles from their faces. The voices of the men were loud and booming as if the wine they drank affected their hearing. I handed a plate of tart to one of the serving women, who carried it to the table and set it in front of Colonial Hawkins. "So how many rebel prisoners did your men bag, Colonial?" asked Master Lockton. I passed another dish of tart. The Colonial shook his head. "Near 3,000 of the devils. Wish we could have shot them all." My hand shook as I reached for the third. "Why so?" Lockton asked. "We've no place to put them." The Colonial pushed the tart to the side and reached into the bowl of shelled almonds in the middle of the table. He tossed a few into his mouth and crunched loudly. "I thought you were using the bridewell," Lockton said. "That should provide ample space." The Colonial snorted and shook his head. "The prison is so stuffed the walls are ready to burst. We've had to pack them into the sugar houses and the confiscated churches, too." He reached for more nuts. "It's a right nuisance. Never thought we'd have so many." "I'd say so many prisoners are a badge of honor for your men and the king," Lockton said. The Colonial raised his eyebrow. "We do not need a badge of honor. We need a decent plague to take them off our hands." The men around the table chuckled. "The expense of feeding them will be staggering." The rebels planted the seeds of war. Let them enjoy their harvest. Lockton ate a forkful of tart. "Force the local patriots to feed them." "I say shoot 'em," growled the men who looked like Edward the Bull. "Of course. Then we have to dispose of the bodies. Messy work, that." "Waste of ammunition," the Colonial said. "And some members of Parliament would fuss like wet hens. No, I predict a cold winter will dispatch most of them in a neutral way." Lady Seymour spoke up. "What if the rebels decide that turnabout is fair play? We need to care for them so they do not harm their British captives." "With all due respect, ma'am," the man said with a smile, "the rebels would first have to capture a prisoner. Given their blunders, it is an unlikely prospect." Lady Seymour nodded gravely. "What of the prisoners they took after their victory at Breed's Hill?" The table fell very still at that. Talk of what happened at Breed's Hill in Boston was as rude as stating that Madame's false eyebrow was about to fall off. But Lady Seymour was the wealthy, elderly widow of a British lord, incapable of social air, so all pretended she had not said a word. Several men cleared their throats and reached for their wine. Madame lifted her goblet. "I am told there are plans to reopen the John Street Theatre," she said loudly. "The heralds a return to civilization and order." Her eyebrow flopped into the rice pudding. The man seated to her right coughed loudly into his napkin. The wine steward's face turned the color of a plum, and a serving girl bit down on her lip to prevent a laugh. Madame avoided looking at her pudding. "A toast," she said with a wobbling voice. "A toast to civilization," Lockton added. "I've heard plans for a cricket club, too." As the men roared in approval, I carried the tray loaded with the dirty supper dishes down the stairs. On my return trip upstairs, I carried 2 pots of coffee. My trips up and down the stairs continued until my knees threatened to fold up and quit, bringing dishes down, carrying more delicacies and hot drinks up, down, 100 miles of stairs in one night. As the candles gutted out and were replaced with new, Madame and Lady Seymour retired to their bedchambers, and Lockton's business companions left to play billiards in the King's Head Tavern. The officers requested more coffee, lit their pipes, and unrolled their maps across the tablecloth, stained now with splashes of turtle soup, butter, wine, and candle wax. The servant girls moved down to the kitchen, where kettles of water were put on to boil for the washing of the dishes. The cook was long departed, and Sarah dozed on a kitchen chair, her swollen feet propped up on a pillow. I picked up the enormous bowl of table scraps and headed out the back door. Miss Mary Finch always mixed table scraps with muck and spread the smelly mess on her garden come spring, but the Locktons weren't much for growing things, not when the markets were so close to hand. Scraps here were dumped down the privy. I closed the door behind me and stopped. The cold air took my breath away. The sky was a black curtain, the stars ice chips whittled by an old knife. I wrapped the shawl tighter across my shoulders and pulled it high to protect my neck. Through the kitchen window, I could see two of the women squabbling about who would wash and who would dry. The second-floor windows glowed with candlelight, shadowed by the shapes of the officers circling around the map. I shuddered and my teeth banged together. Water would turn solid tonight. It was a bad night to be without a blanket. Would they truly allow prisoners to freeze to death? The soldier wives stopped arguing and the men lit fresh candles. The stars wheeled above me and inside, deep inside, something turned. I could not name it nor recognize its form. I drew in a cold breath and blew it skyward. The air came out of me in the shape of a cloud. It drifted above the rooftop and dissolved into the stars. Would they let him starve? The stars said not a word. The back door banged open and I jumped. "Don't, Terry," said Sarah. "You need to dry the last of them glasses afore you lay yourself to sleep." "Yes, ma'am, as soon as I finish this." I quickly carried the scrap bowl out into the yard, walking past the privy all the way back to the stable wall where straggly holly bushes grew. I glanced quick at the house to make sure no one was watching, then pulled aside the prickly branches of the bush and set the bowl down within it. I covered the bowl with my apron on my way back to the house. I loaded my arms with firewood. I doubted she'd notice I'd left the bowl outside, not with me bringing in extra wood. I took another deep breath of the frozen air before I opened the door, confused that I should be so awake after such a long day. I frowned as my thoughts tumbled and multiplied. I had been invaded. A dim plan had hatched itself in my brain pan without my consent, and I did not much like it. Chapter 35. Monday, December 2nd, 1776. Young men, ye should never again fight against your king. Scottish sergeant scolding rebel troops after the defeat of Fort Washington. I had to wait 3 days to sneak up to the prison. My chance came when Madam received an invitation from a friend who had moved into an abandoned rebel mansion in Greenwich Village, north of the city line. Madam smiled in triumph as she read the note, then told me to clean her best shoes. After the midday meal, the soldier wives helped Lady Seymour and Madam into the carriage. I brought out foot warmers filled with hot coals and heavy blankets to lay over the women, for the air was crackling and cold. The driver snapped the whip above the heads of the horses and the carriage rolled away. The soldier wives waited until it was out of sight, then dashed off to visit their own friends. When they were gone, the house stood empty for the first time in months. I lined my shoes and cap with newspaper to keep out the wind and emptied the leftovers hiding under the holly bush into a bucket that I covered with an old rag. I stood across the street from the Bridewell prison and pondered hard. Don't do this. Don't do this. All around the common folks went on their business. Soldiers rubbing the cold out of their fingers, women wrapped in long cloaks and thick shawls. They walked over the ground where the gallows had built last summer, where they hung the traitor Hickey. Back in August, the Patriots had torn it down to use the wood for barricades. The British had built their own hangman's platform at the opposite end of the commons. It could kill 3 people at a time. The ashes of my soul stirred. Don't do this. Men stood at the windows of the prison, calling out to those who passed by. Few folk looked in their direction, pretending the noise came from the throats of the crows circling overhead. Go back, 'tis not your affair. The whispers in my brain pan grew louder as I crossed the street. Madam will beat you bloody. He's not your concern. It's not your place. Go back before it's too late. The crows cawed and wheeled and beat their shiny black wings against the wind-whipped clouds. They saw everything. I stopped in front of the iron-studded oak door and frowned. He freed me from the stocks. He is my friend, my only friend. With that, the ashes settled and shushed. My arms lifted light as a feather and pounded the door knocker. A giant guard opened up. What do you want? He growled. He looked like he had been fashioned by setting boulders atop boulders. His hands were iron mallets, and his face rough carved out of granite. He was a mountain, clothed in a lobsterback uniform. Another do-gooder, he grunted when I explained my mission. He lifted the corner of the rag that covered my bucket and sniffed. You got anything tasty in there? Scraps, sir. The mistress normally feeds them to the pigs, but she's a good soul and told me to bring them for the prisoners. I lied. He grunted, peered into the bucket, and poked through it with a finger. Rice pudding? Yes, sir. The guard crossed the room, took the bowl down from the shelf, and used the spoon to dish the rice pudding from the bucket. And you're kin to this boy you seek? He asked. My older brother, sir, I lied. Always was a stubborn cuss. Made Mamma cry herself to sleep at night. Why ain't your mother here then? She's dead, sir. That much was true. The guard was more interested in rice pudding than my patchwork story. He shoveled several spoonfuls in his mouth and chewed while looking me over. Come on, then, he said, taking a ring of keys from a hook on the wall. I'll give ye a little time. The sound of his key turning in the lock brought back my time in the City Hall dungeon, with the mad woman and the rats. Despite the cold, a trickle of sweat inched down my backbone. We walked down a hall lined with 4 doors on each side, and at the end, a staircase. He stopped at the last door on the right and unlocked it. Here we go, he said. The cell was a little bigger than the one I had been confined in. It was filled with men and boys milling around like nervous cattle herded into a goat pen. There was no fire burning, nay, not even a hearth where it could burn. A short man dressed in black peered out of the cell's one window stuck in the middle of the outside wall. The man's collar was flipped up to protect his neck, his hat was pulled down, and his hands were stuck in his armpits for warmth. The window had bars across it, but no glass. It was an empty hole, open to the rain, wind, and snow. All turned to stare as we entered. Girl, come see her brother, the guard said. Excuse me, sir, I said, as he started to close the door. What about my bucket? He smiled. Needs further inspection. No one said anything, nor moved until the guard finished relocking the door with his footsteps echoed down the hall. You'll be wanting him in the corner, said a short man by the window. Show her. A few of the prisoners stepped on the side so I could see a bundle of rags on the floor. Curzon was lying on the stones with no blankets covering him, nor a pallet under him, not even straw. His leg was still wrapped in the bloody bandage. His lips were dry and cracked. He clutched his hat in one hand. I crouched next to him, unsure what to do. The soldiers around us grew tired of staring and returned to their low conversating. I leaned close to figure if he was breathing. Finally, I put my lips to his ear. Are you dead? I whispered. He answered without moving. No, country. Are you? I near jumped out of my skin. Curzon? His eyes opened slow, bloodshot and bleary. Can you sit up? I asked. Suppose so. I helped pull him upright. He winced and leaned against the wall, shaking with chills. Here. I untied my heavy cloak and laid it over him. He protested. You don't have to. I interrupted him. Hush. Did you get shot? He pulled the cloak up under his chin and shivered again. In the leg. My luck held, though. Bullet went in and out fair clean. Didn't break the bone. He stopped as a man nearby broke into a fit of coughing. I sat next to him. Was it awful? I asked. He closed his eyes and shook his head. You don't want to know. Yes, I do. When the redcoats invaded, he started, we raced up the island to the fort. Figured we'd hold there for months, then drive them from the city come spring when our forces would be stronger. Ha! Spat the man closest to us. He rolled over to face the wall. Did you shoot a gun? I asked. Mostly dug ditches and carried rocks. The soldiers, they worked alongside us, and they drilled to get ready. When the battle finally started, the men fired their guns so fast the barrels grew hot. The cannon smoke was thick as fog. I saw the most horrid sights, country, not fit for the eyes of any person. He swallowed hard. I wound up next to a militia boy from Connecticut. He'd just learned to shave and was a poor hand at it, razor cuts all over his chin. Said he was worried his pa was mad at him on account he didn't make it home for the apple harvest like he promised. He fell silent for a moment, then continued. So this boy, he had 2 muskets, one his own, one from another fellow who died on Long Island. When the Hessians came at us, the boy would shoot one gun whilst I reloaded the other. We continued thus, loading and shooting half the day. The British moved their small cannons up the hill and took aim, but I loaded. He shot. He paused to wipe his eyes on his sleeve. As I handed him his gun, a cannonball ripped his head from his body. We sat without a word. The ashes within me swirled and filled up my throat again. Around us, men muttered low and coughed. Curzon let his tears run. After that, I shot the guns for myself, took the bullet in my leg, but kept firing. An hour or so later, Colonial McGaw surrendered the fort. We laid down our weapons and walked out. The British called for our officers to walk forward, and we feared they'd be shot. Were they? I asked. Not hardly. He sat up a little straighter. Officers get special treatment on account of able to walk around the city, they live in the boarding houses, and eat regular. The man who faced the wall muttered a string of curses that echoed against the stones. He said every kind of bad word imaginable about officers, gentlemen, the war, the British, and the Congress. And he cursed himself for leaving his wife and farm in Maryland. Curzon's tears dried, leaving a thin trail of salt down his cheeks. You should go home now. Before I could ask one of the 100 questions, the key turned in the lock and the guard appeared. He stuck out my bucket. Inspection complete, he said, wiping a smear of the butter off the side of his face. I stood and walked to the door and looked in the bucket. Half the food was gone. May I stay a while longer? I asked. "Sing out when you need me," the guard said with an unsettling wink. As soon as the door was relocked, a man with powder burns on his face snatched the bucket from my hands. "I'll take that," he snarled. I held tight to the handle and shouted, "Give it back!" The man grabbed my arm, his fingers like the claws of a panther. "Enough!" shouted a powerful voice. The cell fell silent as a tomb. The short man dressed in black limped over to us from his post by the window. "Release that bucket, Private Dibdin," he ordered. The thief did as he was asked, but crossed his arms over his chest and stood his ground. "She brought food for the black boy, Sergeant," he complained. "That ain't right for the slave to eat while we starve." The tiny sergeant stood motionless. Somewhere water was dripping. "No one here will starve as long as I have breath." He turned to me. "Excuse the poor manners, miss, but we've not eaten for 3 days. Hungry men are sometimes rude." "I understand," I said. "Would you be willing to share what you brought?" he asked. "We would all be most grateful." I looked the sergeant in the eye. He wasn't much taller than me. "There's not enough to feed everyone." "I know that, miss, but we're all equal hungry." "Don't fuss, Country," Curzon asked. "We fought together, we'll eat together." Outside, a heavy cart rolled down Broadway, the driver calling to his horses. There was an argument from the cell on the other side of the wall and a thump from the one above. I handed the bucket to Curzon. The nasty man dug his claws into my shoulder. "The sergeant goes first." I waited for him to release me, fighting the urge to bite his wrist down to the bone. Once he let go, I gave the bucket to the sergeant. He looked inside and pulled out a piece of pie crust the length of my finger. He handed the bucket to Curzon, who removed a long parsnip peel. The bucket made its way around the room at a snail's pace, as each man studied the contents and chose a small portion of discarded potato or bread or gristle. When it was returned to me, I was confuddled. "There's still food in here," I said. "These are fine men," the sergeant said with pride. "Each took his portion without stealing from the next. Mind if we send it round again?" "No, sir." As the bucket went down the line again, the sergeant motioned for me to stand with him close to the wall. "I wonder if I might ask a favor." "What kind of favor?" I asked. "We need to pass messages on to our captain. He'll be able to get word out of the city. Some of the other womenfolk who bring food to the prisoners are helping in this manner." "I can't spy for you." No, not a spy. Simply a message carrier. You come by here, I drop a word or two in your ear, and you pass it along. It will put me in danger. There's a way for you to continue our fight for freedom." The bucket was moving more quickly the second time around. "I cannot, sir. I was a fool enough to let the patriots hurt me again." The key sounded in the lock as the bucket returned to my hands, wiped empty this time. The guard entered. Curzon struggled to his feet and handed me my cloak. "Here." "No," I said, "you keep it. As soon as I fell asleep, it would be borrowed. Little sister, bring it next time you come." I wrapped the warm cloak around my shoulders and was struck with a sudden notion. I pulled the newspaper out from my cap and quickly removed the pages lining my shoes. "Can you use this?" "Hurry up," said the guard. Curzon smiled. "Just what I need for a bed," he said. "Go on home now." I nodded, grateful to be leaving and heavy with guilt. "You'll be here when I return?" "Don't plan on leaving any time soon," he said. Chapter 36. Tuesday, December 3rd through Friday, December 13th, 1776. Our private soldiers in your hands are treated in a manner shocking to humanity, and that many of them have perished through hunger had it not been for the charitable contributions of the inhabitants. General George Washington complaining to British General William Howe. Lady Seymour was struck by a fever whilst visiting up in Greenwich. She had to be carried to her chamber, her skin the color of an old beeswax candle. Dr. Destouge came to bleed her so that her bodily humours would go back into balance. When the bleeding was over, Madame saw the doctor to the door. I was dusting the grandfather clock in the front hall. "Good sir," Madame said in a low voice, "I believe our aunt would recover faster in our estate in Charleston. She could sit in the sun for hours and breathe the healthful air. Don't you agree?" The doctor's bushy eyebrows flew up in alarm. "South Carolina is hundreds of miles from here, over bad roads. Lady Seymour would be dead by Philadelphia." Which was likely Madame's intention, I thought. The doctor pulled on his gloves and picked up his bag. "I doubt she'll be well enough to travel until spring. I will call again tomorrow." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Madame." Lady Seymour's bell rang upstairs as the door closed behind him. Madame squeezed her lips together so tight I thought she had taken them off. "Girl," she spat, "go see what she wants." By supper it had been decided that I would tend Lady Seymour while she was bedridden. The master used his connections with the British High Command to secure extra firewood for the house, declaring that his aunt's bedchamber be kept as warm as the month of June. The heat of the room helped to bake out with fever in Lady Seymour's blood and ease her cough. 'Twas warm enough that I could go about in stocking feet, which was a comfort, for my shoes had taken to pinching my toes something wicked. As she recovered, the lady took to reading all of the newspapers printed in the city. Whenever she dropped off to sleep, I would steal as many sentences as I could. Thusly I followed the progress of the war, what was left of it. The flame of independence was sputtering and expected to burn out any day. The rebels had run out of ammunition, soldiers, and money. Mayor Matthews, him who plotted to kill General Washington, escaped from the rebel prison and returned to New York in triumph. The American Congress, frightened by the marching British, fled Philadelphia and ran to Baltimore. Newport, in my home state of Rhode Island, fell to the British too. When I read that last bit of news, I was stunned. I had not spared the thought for Rhode Island in months. 'Twas several days before I could again sneak up to the Bridewell, toting sausages, crusts, and cheese rinds. The guard stole a few of the sausages and gave me only a few moments to conversate. It mattered not. Curzon was not feeling up to much talk. I sat on the stone floor and checked the hole in his leg. It was hot, but free of yellow pus. Conditions in the prison had eased some. Vulcan Town had donated enough blankets that there was one to be shared between every 2 or 3 men. The British promised each prisoner would receive 2 pounds of pork and hardtack biscuit every week. They did not announce that the pork was often spoiled, nor that the men had to eat it raw, for there was no fire to cook it over. For the next visit, I saved my own helping of mince pie. I filled the bucket with potato scraps and mutton fat and put the pie on top. The guard took the pie, as I had hoped. "I loves a good mince pie," he said as he unlocked the door to the prison, pie crumbs spilling from his mouth. Frozen bodies were stacked in the hall, waiting to be buried in the pits. The clothes had been taken from the bodies to keep the living soldiers warmer. I kept my eyes on the ground of the modesty. Curzon was still not in the mood for conversating, not even a little bit. I thought he looked feverish, but when I went to feel his forehead, he pushed my hand away. The men snickered at that. I took my empty bucket and left. Snow fell all that night. Lady Seymour prepared an errand list for me the next afternoon. She had spent the morning gazing into the fire and had not taken any food. I made bold and suggested that she eat a biscuit with honey, for her own good. "You need strength to get through the winter," I added. She set down her pen, picked up her teacup, and sipped the hot cinnamon water. "I thought it pleased you when I left so much on my plate." "Ma'am?" "The more I leave behind, the more there is for you to take to the prison." She studied me so close I thought she could see my thoughts. "That is where you've been taking the table scraps, isn't it?" My head bobbed once, like a puppet's. "Am I to assume you know someone confined there?" I found my voice. "Yes, ma'am." She sipped again and looked at me over the rim of her teacup. "It is honorable to help a friend in need." "How did you know?" I blurted out. She folded the sheet of paper on the table. "These are the items I would like for you to fetch for me. Purchase the ink and newspaper at Rivington's, but not the books. He overcharges. Go to the shop near the baker on Hanover Square. Elihu said they haven't closed." I bobbed once and took the paper. "Please, ma'am," I tried again. "How did you know?" Her gaze returned to the logs in the hearth. "Take care how you go, Isabel. Many people think it is a fine and Christian thing to help the prisoners. I do not think my niece is one of them." "Yes, ma'am," I whispered. It started to snow whilst I was in Rivington's. The wind blew the snow direct into my face as I crossed the square, and I was grateful to step into the shelter of the stationer's store, for 'twas warm and dry inside, near peaceful, if such a word can be used to describe a shop. A jelly-bellied officer with thick spectacles was purchasing a tall stack of books from the man behind the counter. They were deep in their talk and appeared not to notice me. I took a slow turn around the shop, admiring the shelves heavy with books, business forms, proclamations from Parliament and General Howe, slates, thick paper, quills, and sealing wax. The books called to me. My fingers itched to touch them. It had been months since I dug into the story of Robinson Crusoe. I glanced toward the counter. The men were arguing friendly-like about a fellow named Fiume. They both had their faces planted in the same pamphlet. When I trod on a squeaky board, they did not even look up. I reached up to a bookshelf and flipped my way through the books, standing at attention. The titles were near as long as books themselves. Treatise on the Propagation of Sheep, the Manufacture of Wool, and the Cultivation and Manufacture of Flax by John Wiley, or Cato Major, or His Discourse of Old Age with Explanatory Notes by M.T. Cicero, or Poems of Various Subjects, Religious and Moral by Phyllis Wheatley, and countless tracts containing sermons and advice. My fingers backed up. Mama told me about Miss Wheatley. She was kidnapped in Africa, sold in Boston, and wrote fancy poetry that smart people liked. She had visited London and England. She had been an enslaved girl, but was a free woman. I took the slim book off the shelf and opened the cover. I had never read a poem. What if I lacked the skill? What if I were caught? Might as well throw myself in the river. Bang! The closing door startled me, so I near dropped the volume. I quickly set it back on the shelf and approached the counter. Can I help you? Asked the young man who stood behind it. Yes, please, sir. I handed him the list. From the Lady Seymour. I hear she's been poorly, he said as he looked over the list. Yes, sir, but she is strong enough to sit by the fire now and has a powerful urge to read. He nodded. She's a good customer. I'm glad she's on the mend. He quickly assembled everything on the list. The letters of the Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, History of the Roman Republic, Volume 1, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, and pulled out a large sheet of paper to wrap them in. As he worked the scissors, he paused. You knew that boy, didn't you? Pardon me? He continued cutting. Bellingham's boy, red hat, quick talker. He creased the paper with his finger. He brought you here once in May, pointed to you out the window, convinced me to hand over 2 fresh-baked rolls, told me you were like to die from hunger if I didn't help. He smiled at the memory. I'm sorry, sir, I said. I didn't mean to take your food. He pulled off a length of twine. You didn't. One of the advantages of courting the baker's daughter is all the bread a man can eat. He had not yet commented on my looking at the books. I feared he might try and trip me up, get me to say something I ought not, but saw no other choice than to be polite. I hope your lady is well, sir, I said. He concentrated on tying a bow. So do I. She fled with her father to a village in Pennsylvania, a place called Hatboro. They make hats there. Clever, don't you think? He tried to smile, but his eyes were downcast and melancholy. Perhaps 'tis safer there, I said. Ay, he said, finishing the bow, with plenty of young men eager to protect her, but that's a tale for another day. He kept the package in his hands, lost in the thought. Master Lockton will settle his aunt's account at the end of the week, I said. Oh, ay. He gave me the package and waited as I settled it in my basket. I hear tell you're one of them who feeds the lads in the bridewell? A sizzling log in the hearth popped suddenly, and I jumped. Not me, sir. Begging pardon, but someone is mistaken. He crossed his arms over his chest and shook his head. That there mark on your face makes you hard to forget, lass. The heat from the hearth filled the room and made it hard to breathe. My eyes darted to the windows and I fought to breathe. I fought the urge to run. It felt like all of New York was watching me. He leaned forward, put his elbows on the counter, and lowered his voice, though we were the only people in the shop. You tell them boys in the jail to hang on. There's plenty of us out here trying to help. Sir? He removed a slim volume from under the counter. This is for you. Don't let your mistress see it. I cannot read, sir, I lied. He snorted once as he quickly wrapped the book. Of course you can't. He pushed the package to my side of the counter. All who love liberty should commit the words to heart. I can't take it, I started. I cannot pay. I only have a few left, those I should burn, he said with a wave of his hand. Read it, pass it on, and keep feeding the lads. I bobbed once and hid the parcel in my pocket under my apron. As soon as I could stand close enough to the fire, I'd get rid of it. The last thing I needed was more trouble on account of independence. Yes, sir, I said, hurrying to the door. Thank you, sir. He raised his finger to his lips in a last warning. Shh.